Hi, I'm Olivia Dreier, the director of Karuna Center for Peacebuilding, a nonprofit in Amherst, Massachusetts that was founded in 1994 by psychologist and peace activist Paula Green. Its mission is to address the wounds of war and promote reconciliation. Together with local partners, we engage former enemy groups in dialogue and joint activities that help them rebuild trust and rediscover their common humanity. To date, we have worked in some 30 war-torn countries. While the need for this work seems to be growing, we are heartened by the response and awed by the courage of local peace builders. Most of our programs are overseas, but we are increasingly leading dialogues here in the U.S. to help bridge our own growing divides. This series, Karuna In The World, aims to share insights into the work we do around the globe.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Karuna and the World, where we discuss Karuna Center for Peacebuilding's programs around conflict-affected countries in the world. My name is Mehlaqa Samdani. I am the Director of Critical Connections, a local nonprofit organization, and a partner with Karuna Center in bridging local divides here in Western Massachusetts. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by Olivia Dreier, who is the Executive Director of Karuna Center for Peacebuilding, and she recently returned from Rwanda, where she checked in on the progress of one of the several reconciliation projects that they have run in the country with local partners over the last 2 decades. Olivia, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
It was great to have you here. And before we get into the details of the program that you were overseeing there, Olivia, I thought it would be important to sort of set the larger context. Rwanda is currently commemorating the 24th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, where 800,000 Tutsis and many thousands of moderate Hutus were killed by government-backed Hutu militias over the course of 3 months. Can you tell us what actually led to the Rwandan genocide and what were conditions like in the immediate aftermath?
Sure. It's a complex history, but very, very briefly. There are 2 major ethnic groups in Rwanda, Hutu and Tutsi. Tutsi were about 15% of the population, Hutu about 85%. They actually share a language and to a large extent share a culture, but originally came from different parts of Africa. There was a Tutsi monarchy before colonialism, so they were the rulers. They did have the power and the wealth. They owned cows. Hutus were farmers, but Hutus could become Tutsis if they were granted cows by the royalty, so it was somewhat fluid. When the colonialists came, it was first the Germans. It was divide and rule. They saw the Tutsis as a noble race. They handed out identity cards and really created much more division than there had ever been. Then at independence, Hutus, who had over time begun to feel themselves as an oppressed group, really rose up. They, of course, won the elections since they were 85%. They formed a Hutu power party and really discriminated heavily against the Tutsis. After independence, there were several ethnic cleansings of Tutsis.
And when did independence actually happen?
Early 1959.
I see.
And after independence, there were a series of pogroms where Tutsis were killed. Many fled to neighboring countries. And unfortunately, the international community turned a blind eye. Rwanda was seen as a development darling. There were all kinds of development programs. Nobody paid attention to these human rights abuses or these killings. So there was an increased sense of impunity. A refugee army in Uganda started insisting on power sharing, making incursions into the country, essentially starting a civil war.
And these were Tutsis?
This was a Tutsi army, yeah, thanks. Then the international community got involved, pushed a peace agreement. The president of Rwanda, the Hutu president, signed the agreement. His plane was shot down on the return, many think by extremists in his party. Sure. Then the genocide launched immediately after. It was clearly well planned by extremists in the party. And as you said, in 100 days, up to 1 million Tutsi moderate Hutus killed, apparently a faster killing rate than Nazi Germany. Just extraordinary, largely by machete. The country was totally devastated. I got to know a woman who had fought in the Tutsi army that came in, who became, at 26, the Minister of Health, Women and Youth in this newly formed, actually mixed government when that army ended the genocide after the international community dithered and essentially did nothing. Her first job was what to do with all the bodies, just littered the country. Her next job was what to do with 500,000 orphans that were being warehoused. Wow. She apparently got on the radio and asked every woman in Rwanda, without mentioning ethnicity, to take in a child and actually place them within about 6 months. That's incredible. And that really began a lot of extraordinary efforts by this initial government, but the challenges were enormous.
Of course. And so, I mean, again, like you mentioned, some of those reconciliation initiatives almost started immediately. And now when we sort of, 24 years later, look at Rwanda, on the surface it seems very stable, criminal activity is very low, economic development is happening at a wonderful pace, and Rwanda seems to be like a donor's darling in many ways. But where has Karuna Center decided or chosen to focus its efforts, and why?
So Karuna Center really got involved in 2003, and it was just as the government was planning what was called Gacaca, which was this local form of justice, where locally elected judges, no mention of Hutu or Tutsi, presided over weekly hearings. It sort of functioned as a kind of truth commission as well as a form of justice. The whole community participated. People were perpetrators were encouraged to confess. The whole community acted as witnesses. And if there were confessions, sentences were reduced. And people could, instead of going to prison, go to work camps. So this was an extraordinary process that actually went on all over Rwanda for something like 7 years, with a couple of million cases tried. When we got involved, the government was just planning this. We worked with the Department of Justice on thinking about the community impacts of that process. Also with the government's National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, again on sort of thinking about social reconstruction. You know, what would be the effects on communities? How would you rebuild relationships at the community level? Because in Rwanda, there was never any geographic separation between Hutu and Tutsis. They lived in mixed communities. Perhaps our biggest project early on then was with a network of women's organizations, some 50 women's organizations, that wanted to make peace and reconciliation core to their mission, whether they were focusing on the Women's Caucus in Parliament or on literacy at the community level. So we worked with them for quite a few years on integrating a peace and reconciliation mission.
Excellent. And so you mentioned a couple of times that, you know, the government had instituted a lot of these programs, sort of reconciliation efforts. There was the transitional justice program, like the Gacaca. And it seems like it was, most of this was state sanctioned, sort of top-down social engineering of sorts. And what is your sense, having worked there for over 2 decades, in terms of how much receptivity was there at the grassroots level and among the community members? You know, especially among families who had lost lost many family members and were now the survivors of the genocide. As those Gacaca proceedings were happening and as those reconciliation initiatives were being implemented, were the survivors feeling like they had to forgive in order for society to move on, or did it seem more heartfelt for them?
Oh, those are all really, really great questions. When I think Rwanda is just a fascinating case study in kind of post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation. And it's a mixed picture. On the one hand, it's just extraordinary, the progress they've made 24 years after a genocide. The country's at peace, there's law and order. It isn't a country with rich resources, but very good anti-poverty programs, health programs, education programs. However, it's still very top-down. It's a democracy, but with a very tight control.
Sure.
And the general from the army that invaded, Kagame,
Yes.
is the president. And they changed the constitution so he could have a third term.
And he again came in August 2007.
That's right. And, you know, in many ways, I mean, some people might say it's a benevolent dictatorship of sorts, but I think he's really working hard for the good of the country. What worries many people, including me, is that in Rwandan culture, Rwandans tell me, there's a long tradition from the days of the monarchy of following orders, doing what you're told, always being in this very stratified hierarchical society. People carried out the genocide because they were told to. In some cases, they may have felt, Hutus may have felt they'd be killed if they didn't, and in some cases that happened, but still this strong sense of following orders and a lack of critical thinking. And so as this country proceeds in a very top-down way, there's real worries that unless there's space to really question processes, question the government, one's not shifting something very fundamental that's problematic. And the government also took the approach of saying, you know, this Hutu Tutsi thing is what got us into trouble. That was really a creation of the colonialists. We're all one culture, we speak one language. Let's just say we're all Rwandans, and we won't even use those words.
In fact, there are laws against sort of declaring your ethnicity
You
openly.
can declare your ethnicity, but genocide ideology is a criminal offense, and just what that means is very loosely interpreted. So you can say you're a Hutu or Tutsi, but people are definitely very wary of doing so. And though it's a mixed government, clearly the Tutsi elite that came in from the diaspora, they hold the economic and political power. So, and interestingly enough, the proportion of Tutsis and Hutus is about the same. So about 1 million were killed, about 1 million came in from the diaspora, and they hold the power. So I do worry longer term about Hutus who carry the weight of the shame of a genocide and now have no power, still feeling like there's not enough space for them. So that's a concern. On the other hand, you have to hand it to what the government has been able to do.
Absolutely. Well, that's really interesting. And sort of coming to the current project that you just recently witnessed, what is that about, and how does it address some of the challenges that Rwanda is currently experiencing?
Right. So we did an assessment actually for U.S. aid in 2011, a conflict vulnerability assessment. So a lot of the ideas with extensive interviews, you know, at all levels of society. So a lot of our ideas for this program came out of that assessment. Gacaca process was just winding down, though that had been an extraordinary process and had really brought the truth to light. It was a justice process. It wasn't really a reconciliation process. And we knew that after that process, many had already completed their prison sentences or their work camp sentences. They were going to start returning to their communities. And there was no real structure in place for the communities themselves to reconcile. And because it was mixed communities, you were going to have people coming back into the community, living next door to survivors where they may have killed family members. Often that's the case. And how were they going to rebuild? So the project, to tell you a little bit about its basic structure, works with 3 different partner organizations. One has a long history of doing community dialogue and is very sensitive to just how much political space there is for open and honest dialogue in the country. Another does trauma healing with survivors and perpetrators together, so that they come to recognize that trauma is actually something they share, which is rather extraordinary. And I think for the survivors to see the trauma that perpetrators went through because of the acts they committed is very, very powerful. And actually is an important step to them feeling that they can perhaps forgive and reconcile. So that's the second arm. Then we have a third arm, which is working with youth, and that's through the Genocide Museum in the capital that does these education programs with youth. We're in 16 communities. So we have all 3 arms working in each community. The youth are creating peace clubs in their community of mixed heritage, Hutu and Tutsi, doing projects for vulnerable populations, organizing intergenerational dialogues, because they're kind of now, there's a big intergenerational gap for those who grow up post-genocide. And they're also collecting positive stories of reconciliation on video and putting them out on social media. And now they're doing something just recently that they call interactive voice technology, where Rwanda has many cell phones, but not smartphones.
I see.
They've recorded these short stories that if you dial into a certain number, press 1, you hear the story. You press 2, you comment and record your own story.
Wow.
And we just launched this last month, and in 2 weeks had 16,000 calls.
My
so
goodness.
that's a kind of way of reaching out more broadly.
Absolutely.
And maybe one more thing to mention about the program itself is in all of our programs where we're doing community-based reconciliation, we're also really concerned with reaching policymakers as well.
Yes.
So we've created meetings between local government officials and our participants, and then every 6 months or so, these national listening sessions where representatives come and speak to their national policymakers about both their successes and challenges. And I was just in Rwanda for one of those.
I would love to know more about that, but I'm interested in learning how you choose the communities and the community members. How do they enroll in the program? And do they come voluntarily? Are they recruited? And the program that you're running, how closely coordinated is it with the government? And is the government, of course, aware, because you have these huge listening sessions and you work with policymakers, but does it need state sanction?
All good questions. So the communities were selected by our local partners. We had the whole program was co-designed with these local partners. And they selected communities in which they felt post-genocide tensions were still very, very high.
I see.
And that was for all kinds of reasons, diverse group of reasons, depending on how the genocide unfolded in different places. And 16 communities is a small number, but in many ways we're trying to create a model that could hopefully spread. They went into the communities, they were some connections already, but they would meet with the local officials, explain what they were doing, gather interested people, explain what they were doing. It was all voluntary. So they, based on people's interest, invited them to sessions about the dialogue club, about what the trauma healing workshops would be. And then, it's really self-selected. With the dialogue clubs, though they, based on interest and seeming capacity, selected 2 people from each community to be trained as facilitators. So they're now facilitating the dialogues.
Great.
And then with the trauma healing, they select 2 people from each community to be what they call healing companions. that then go for very intensive training and then go back to their communities to be kind of peer counselors and also do trainings themselves with support from our partner organization.
That's really interesting. And I'm very interested in the third component of the program, you working with youth. And all of those young people who were born after the genocide, what is your experience interacting with them in terms of how they see it now? And I mean, are they more aware of their identities, and if they were Hutus, do they feel guilt, transgenerational guilt? And if they were, Tutsis, do they feel the trauma that their families experienced? How do they approach the genocide?
Well, of course, it's very, very varied, and one of the things that we're encountering is that it's not being talked about enough. Rwandan culture is such that people are quite inward. They don't easily talk about difficult things. But what I'm told is that the younger generation is quite different. I don't know whether it's because they're exposed to, various global influences. They want to know. And if their parents aren't talking, they're on the internet finding out and then finding all sorts of warped information. In some cases, Hutu parents who were involved in the genocide are not being honest about what they actually did. Youth are asking. It's hard for them to speak. In some cases, survivors are still very bitter and trauma is being passed on. Interestingly enough, in the Dialogue Club session that I witnessed, they were talking very, very openly about this and what can they do. And they were speaking about the need for them to speak openly with their own children. Apparently the last intergenerational dialogues were very, very successful, especially since youth were real initiators with them. I think it's really going to take time. But if it's not talked about with the younger generation, it is going to be a problem.
And there's a limit to how much can be talked about, given the limits and the limited political space and space for sort of open conversation, given some of the laws that are in place, given the sort of restrictions around civil society engaging around these issues.
I mean, I think there is space to talk about what actually happened. And that the government does encourage. I talked to one perpetrator who killed during the genocide, who spoke at every April there's a commemoration. Usually it's very survivors focused. He spoke at his commemoration. He told me his family hadn't wanted to believe that he killed during the genocide. And he said, I felt it was very important for them to know I did. He said, I'm not proud of what I did, but I am proud that I can speak about it. So that, that's a very powerful example. I don't think everybody's there. I talked to some survivors who said, we feel that many of the ex-perpetrators are only telling partial truths, but we understand the weight of their shame and that it's a process. And if they can tell a little bit of the truth now, we hope with time they'll tell more of the truth. I thought that sort of showed an incredible, almost unbelievable amount of empathy. On the survivor's part. I would have thought you'd be furious if somebody you knew was hiding half the truth. But they kept saying, it was translated for me in Kenya, Rwanda, but frequently whatever they were saying was translated as, we think reconciliation is a journey. It's
incredible. And so even though, we tend to think of some of these initiatives as, especially the government sanctioned one, as being top down and, social engineering, the fact that it's created so much stability and connections between former survivors and perpetrators is quite incredible in the way stability has come to Rwanda. So that is absolutely amazing. What lessons, and I'm sure there are many, that Rwanda can teach the rest of the world?
I think there are many. I mean, I think Rwanda is forced to reconcile because the communities are so integrated. But they're doing it now, at least 24 years later, quite powerfully and with this kind of openness that I found remarkable. So I think the first big lesson is that this degree of reconciliation is possible even after genocide. And I think it's so important for those positive stories to be told. Sure. And actually, we were very pleased that a National Geographic photographer spent a week with our program last winter. And in the April issue of the National Geographic, which focuses on race, there are pictures and stories of our participants who have reconciled. Examples where a perpetrator and survivor, where the perpetrator killed family members, have reconciled. And when I was there and brought some issues of the National Geographic and showed them to our participants, some of the representatives from the communities, they were rightly very proud that their stories are being told around the world. I think, though, what also is an important lesson is the role of acknowledgement. That you can't, if you're a survivor, you can't really forgive unless you feel the perpetrator is acknowledging what he or she has done. And I think this gacaca process, it had its flaws, it wasn't perfect, but the fact that so much truth did come out made that possible. So I feel like that's another big piece.
And that's a very important point. I mean, this the power behind acknowledgement and the significance that it can hold, and so that brings us to the U.S. And yes, there are many divides right now that this country is grappling with, but in terms of the racial divides, and which seem to be ongoing and have not completely been healed. In fact, it's a sort of festering wound almost. What role does acknowledgement play here in this country when it comes to African Americans, when it comes to slavery, and when it comes to the treatment of Native Americans? And what kinds of initiatives would it take for that kind of healing to begin, if at all? I mean, of course, every population is different in how it receives an apology, but or acknowledgement of something that was done to them in the past. But what do you think that how could that play out here?
Again, a huge and important question. I think we don't deal with our past at our peril. And I think it keeps haunting us when we don't. So I think that's one reason why, maybe because things were so extreme in Rwanda, they had to, but I think that bodes well for their future.
Sure.
I think, with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, various ways these things are coming up, we keep seeing that, we haven't dealt with this, and we need to as a society. I think there are big questions of, is apology enough? Right. What about reparations? Sure. There have been some very localized truth and reconciliation efforts that I think I've heard about that I think are very important. But, I think it really needs much more of a national conversation, and that we can't just sort of sweep it away as the past and forge ahead into the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Olivia. I wish we could continue the conversation. It's been so fascinating talking to you, but unfortunately we're at the end of our time. So thank you so much once again.
Well, thank you for all the good questions.
Absolutely. Until next time, this is all for Karuna and the World.